So I've been thinking a lot recently about the way that gender has become so central in US politics in a way that I really wouldn't have expected about 10 years ago when I was in university. Specifically, the way that sex, gender, and sexual orientation have gone from being a more esoteric queer studies thing to really front and center in the political mainstream. Specifically, trans issues seem to be really animating for large segments of the Republican base, and especially the Republican politicians who are stirring up hate right now. So, I wanted to just talk a little bit about my thoughts on why that might be, and also voice my opinions about this subject to act as, I guess, some sort of resistance to the inevitable, well, not inevitable, but the likely hate filled next 4 years that the queer community is going to experience as a result of Donald Trump and those who support him. So, for context, I went to school about 10 to 12 years ago. I'm starting to date myself a little bit, but I went to school about 10 to 12 years ago at a University of California, or UC campus, in a really dynamic time in terms of social change in this country, and especially discourse around social change in this country. University campuses are always, to the left of the mainstream of American society. They're almost labs for new ideas and for forward thinking, at least in their most idealized form. And I can say, as a student in university in 2014, 2015, 2016, I was really engaged with, I guess, the forefront of what has now become labeled wokeism, or the woke left. In fact, when I was in my freshman year of university, I actually not engaged, but I enrolled in a LGBTQ plus studies class. And even that term itself sounds, I think, interesting at this point, about 10 years later, because I think now the class would probably just be called queer studies and cut out the whole alphabet soup part in the beginning. Although at the time, the addition of the Q plus was seen as more progressive and a kind of a bridge from the old LGB or LGBT to a more expansive idea about queerness. And that really has, although it has its roots earlier, the mainstream nature of it really came to the forefront in the mid 2010s or so, especially on university campuses, online, spaces like Tumblr. Kind of the younger generation was hungry for, I guess, a more expansive idea about what it is to be queer. So what's really interesting looking back is I really remember at the core of the curriculum, like the central point of this intro to LGBTQ studies class was the idea that sex is different from gender, is different from sexual orientation. And while it sounds not so, I guess, new in 2025, in 2013, this was not, I guess, the most commonly known thing, especially among, I guess, the mainstream American public. And to be honest, this is still something that the mainstream American public actually really struggles with, and we'll get to that a little bit later. It kind of seemed like this almost academic exercise. Obviously, queer people, trans people, and gender non-binary people have always existed, but I guess, for a lack of a better term, it didn't seem as relevant to everyone else at the time. I guess in the mind of my younger self, it felt like if someone was trans or if someone was non-binary, that's kind of their business. And, we're just looking at the way that those people might be discriminated against, but we're not going to see this be the big issue deciding the 2024 election. And I'm not saying that the only issue deciding the 2024 election was the trans rights issue. Obviously, inflation and Joe Biden's age and so many other factors, racism against Kamala Harris, factored into that decision. But what was really important was trans rights and the inclusion of trans and non-gender conforming people in American society. That is the issue that the right really latched onto in order to spur up fear, in order to gain votes, in order to create, snappy political ads. The one that really shocked me, but also was so perfectly encapsulated the Republican psyche and the American kind of political circus that we're in, was this whole ad from Donald Trump that was something along the lines of Kamala Harris is for they them, Donald Trump is for you. This whole thing was, I guess, almost bizarre, because here I was in 2014 or 2013 or whenever I took this class thinking, preferred gender pronouns, which is actually interesting thinking about it, because at the time that I was in university, preferred gender pronouns was initially what people would say when referring to gender identity. But then that transitioned from like maybe 2013, 2014 to the 2015, 2016 era to just saying gender pronouns, with the caveat, or not caveat, but with the emphasis that your gender pronouns are your gender pronouns. It's not your preferred gender pronouns. It's your actual gender pronouns. And I think that right there really accelerated. We didn't know it at the time. It was kind of that first domino, but that really accelerated this Republican conservative pushback against a more expansive view in gender in our society. So yeah, I guess all of that is to just basically say that at the time in 2013, 2014, these ideas seemed very esoteric, something that you would study in a, university class, but not something that would be the main political messaging strategy of a major political or presidential campaign on the national level, especially such a divisive and important race as 2024 was. I think it's important to kind of contextualize that, though, because 2013, 2014, I think looking back on it, like maybe 10, 15 years time, those with, the expertise in this field will really look at those 2 years as really pivotal for American social change and the way that a younger generation adopted newer ideas about what justice and liberty are in this nation, and how that was at odds with a older generation's notions of norms, justice, liberty, and freedom in America. And what I'm really specifically referring to is that 2013, 2014 was a pre-George Floyd, a pre Black Lives Matter, a pre-Me Too even movement. And so it's kind of before all these bigger, buzzier social movements that happened in the later part of 2010s or so. But the discussions were happening, of course, on university campuses and among, experts in the field of, gender studies, Black studies, and other, I guess, minority studies, long before they became more of a mainstream debate topic. So, like, literally on day one of the Trump administration, Donald Trump decides that of all the big issues facing the nation, one that really should be top priority, or something that he takes care of on day one, is announcing that there are only two genders and ending DEI policies in the government. And I think, of course, Republicans were never going to love queer rights. I mean, obviously, it's kind of antithetical to a lot of longstanding conservative ideas about family, about the roles of men and women, about, I guess, religion in American society. So it's not surprising to me that Republicans aren't on board with a more expansive view of gender and a more inclusive attitude towards trans people and gender nonconforming people and queer people just in general. However, it is surprising to me, I guess, the level, the ferocity, the extent to which this issue has just animated the right. And I think it says something about them and doesn't say a lot about the people who they're attacking. To me, it says that somewhere deep down, they're insecure. They're afraid of their own place in the world. And they're afraid that if they don't have the privilege of being a man in society anymore, and a man as defined in the, mid-century 1950s sense of the word, what one might say a real man in society, then they don't have much left. Their whole idea of themselves is built on this idea that they are strong, they are providers, women are weaker, and they need to be taken care of. This idea that there's a natural order to things, there are roles to play, and there's a path in life that is clear cut, and we don't need to think too much about who we are, what we're doing, and what our purpose is. It's a lot easier to say, I am this way, I am either A or I am B, and it is in service of God, than to think of the alternative, which is I am a human in the world. We don't know if there's a God. I don't know my place in the universe. There are things that I will never know. There are roles in society, but they're constructed and they can be deconstructed. And I can choose my own destiny within that context. That's a lot more, I guess, scary for a lot of people. And it's a lot easier to just say, things are getting too woke. Things are getting too crazy. The left wants to redefine something as simple as he's a boy and she's a girl. What's next? Without really thinking about it critically. And I think more to the point, it's such a gross overreaction to see this type of social change is so fundamentally threatening to you. To some extent, why does it impact you that much? If you want to be a traditional man, you can be a traditional man. No one's stopping you. If you want to be a traditional woman, you can do that as well. We're just saying that for the small amount of people, and it's relatively small, who don't feel super secure in that identity and have a really, earnest and deep identity with a different gender, or want to even just explore what that might look for them as they navigate their own journey, what does it make a difference to you? That's my biggest question. And I know that's not really a groundbreaking thought, but I think it's worth pausing on, not just like as an individual, but as a culture. Why are we putting so much effort into this issue that's essentially a non-issue for most people? Very few people should actually have really strong views on trans rights, except for trans people and those who know and are allies of trans people. Everyone else really, for the most part, should be able to kind of go about their day not thinking a whole lot about the issue. And then we have a president who wants to make this the defining issue of the era. for a cheap political gain. But what I fear, and what it's a fear, but it's also a hope, is that when the American people see the cruelty of the Republican administration towards trans people, instead of enjoying the cruelty, they might reflect on why they're being bullies. There are people who are sadistic, and there are people who like to bully. But I don't think that's everyone, and I don't think that's most people. And even though a lot of people think the gender stuff, and I'm saying that, using words that they might use, the gender stuff is weird or confusing or doesn't make a whole lot of sense, I don't think they would want to see cruelty towards people. At least I hope not. Anyways, that's it for me today. Just some food for thought. If you wanted to kind of chime in on your thoughts on the Trump administration and the attack on trans rights, obviously feel free to leave a comment. I think where I want to kind of steer this conversation towards is not towards saying whether or not trans people are valid or not. Obviously, I believe they are. I guess I really want to know from trans people, especially, or for people who know trans people very well, what can we do to combat this insidious sort of hatred, especially right now? I don't think what we did in the mid to late 2010s worked. But I do think that there is a path forward, but I just hope it doesn't get too nasty and, horrible before we get the chance to be able to do that. So as a closing question here, I just want to ask, what can we do differently in this decade that went wrong last decade with regards to gender and sexuality? How can we de-escalate some of the vitriol on the right while also making meaningful gains in the lives of trans people, queer people, and the entire LGBT community, especially during a very hostile administration?